Hello and welcome to History 127. One of the first things I like to do in this class is to revisit an old idea which was proposed by a guy named Jared Diamond. He wrote a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And in that book, he tried to explain why it was that Europe was able to conquer basically the rest of the world. We've pushed back on that thesis a little bit, but generally the idea is still holds water, and it's still a really important question for us to deal with. Why is it that in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, why is it that Europe and the Americas were so very different from one another? Why did Europe have more advanced technology? The truth of it is that, yeah, indeed, the Americas, they did not have the sort of technology or material progress that Europe had achieved. Now, one might say that they had other values which were equally important, but nevertheless, there was a significant material difference between the world that Europeans lived in and the world that American Indians lived in. So, why was it? Right? And one of the things that Jared Diamond does in his book is, instead of coming up with some cultural or even racist explanation for why it is that Europeans were more technologically advanced than Native Americans upon the discovery by Europeans of the Western Hemisphere, he proposes that geography has something to do with it. Now, what I'm going to show you first is a map of the Americas, and it's over here. All right? Now, look at this map of the Americas. And now, look at the map of Eurasia. Now, I don't call it Europe, I call it Eurasia, because Europe and Asia really are one landmass, right? Unlike the Americas, that is a very different shape, all right? And yes, you can argue about the differences between Chinese versus European culture, but both had achieved a level of technological and material advancement unmatched by the Americas. And we're talking about the period around the time of Columbus, before the Great Divergence, before Western civilization became premier, mostly through colonizing other countries and reaping the benefits that they could from the resources they found there. But in 1492, why is it that Eurasia and the Americas were so different? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put them this side. I'm going to put them next to each other. Right? Now look. Here's Eurasia next to the Americas. I'm going to give you a second to think about it, but what is different between these two? What is the difference in the shape that you immediately notice between Eurasia and the Americas? Right. One is broad, one is narrow. Okay? Eurasia is broad and the Americas are narrow. Why is this important? Well, for one thing, look at this map here. This shows the temperate zones. Are there more temperate zones in Eurasia or in the Americas? Yeah, Eurasia, right? So it is much easier to travel from all the way to the east in China to Europe than it is from what is today the United States down to the tip of Chile. You don't have to cross through different temperate zones. And of course, it's much more difficult going in the Americas too. Mexico itself is a very mountainous place. If you flatten Mexico out, it would be as large as Russia if you just flatten the mountains of Mexico. So it's a very mountainous, treacherous terrain. So it's much harder to travel across it. Okay, so this ease of transversing Eurasia, what does that have to do with this difference in technological achievement and material wealth in the Americas and in Eurasia? Communication, transportation. You know what it is? It's innovation. People can share ideas. Okay? Now think about this. Was Asia invented in Europe? Was gunpowder invented in Europe? No, it was China, right? Paper too. Okay? These innovations, though it may take a very long time, right? It might take a very long time, could travel from Europe to Asia and back. These ideas could be shared, all right? Whereas in the Americas, it's much more difficult to travel between these two different worlds from north to south because it is so very difficult to transverse these different temperate zones. Okay? So that's one thing we have which is different. All right? So the technology, ideas, they spread much quicker. The truth of it is they didn't have the wheel in the Americas either. So it was even more difficult to travel, right? Whereas, of course, in Eurasia, by the time of Columbus, they had many inventions which helped them even circumnavigate the globe. Now, there's another thing which helped out the colonizers, right? And put the Americans at a disadvantage. And it's not really guns. All right, guns are important. But you know what it is? It's germs. Okay? The vast majority of Native Americans who succumbed to the European colonization died not because of, some battle or fighting. They died from disease, and particularly smallpox, right? But also bubonic plague. Now, why is it that Europeans had immunity to this and the people living in North and South America did not? Well, you know what it has to do with? It has to do with herding animals, all right? What's a herding animal? It's a large animal that can be used by human beings and kept in flocks to procure their hunger needs, right? And in Eurasia, what do we got? We got sheep, right? We got cows. We got horses. We have all kinds of domestic animals that serve human beings and give them the nutrients to grow. That it is true that Europeans were taller than American Indians upon contact, perhaps because they had much more access to meat, right? See, the thing of it is that in the Americas, Native Americans did not really have access to a steady supply of meat. The mastodon had gone extinct in the Pleistocene era about 10,000 years before. In Mexico City, the nobility might, enjoy the occasional chicken, or the Aztec nobility, I should probably say, or the occasional lizard. But generally, the diet was vegetarian, right? South America as well. In fact, the only herding animal native to the Americas is the llama. Okay, the humble llama. But of course, in Europe, in Asia, we have all kinds of animal husbandry which is happening. So that does allow them to grow taller. It also allows them to have more children. Now this one's even more complicated to think about. But of course, in order to nurture children, women must have mother's milk, right? But in Europe and in Asia, where they've domesticated the cow, they have cow's milk. And they can switch the children to cow's milk at a very young age and then have more children because, of course, while nursing, women are less fertile. So the Native Americans had less children because they had less animals as well. But back to germs, right? Smallpox in particular, where did smallpox come from? Why, it came from the cows, right? It came from cows originally. And there were no cows in the Americas to spread this to Native Americans. Now, what happens is that, these germs, this disease, this virus, la viruela, it jumps from the animal kingdom to human beings. We've had this happen in our own times, HDN1 and, of course, HDH1, swine flu, and, of course, coronavirus probably came from bats, right? Smallpox came from bovines and cows. And the thing of it is that it killed a lot of Europeans. It killed a lot of Europeans, but it killed them slowly over time. Agriculture was first, and animals were first domesticated in the Middle East, so probably smallpox spread out from there. And eventually, over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years of slowly spreading to virgin populations that had not been exposed to the virus yet, the entirety of Europe and Asia did become exposed to it, and as a result, those who survived it had immunity. Okay, and the children would have immunity as well in a sort of genetic selection. It was endemic. That's what that means, endemic. Smallpox killed a large number of Europeans over a long period of time. But when smallpox and bubonic plague but particularly smallpox, crossed over the ocean from Europe to the Americas, it was epidemic because Europeans saw their world transformed almost overnight, and they were exposed to so many Europeans, right? When they were exposed to all of these Europeans, they were also exposed to their germs. The Europeans, they either had immunity to smallpox, or smallpox was less contagious in smaller numbers amongst the Europeans, but amongst the Native Americans they had no defense against it whatsoever. And of course it was absolutely epidemic and wiped out, according to some estimates, 80% of the Native American population that existed in the Americas prior to the arrival of Columbus. Wow, that's a really large number, right? 80%. Now, recently, historians have been revisiting this germ thesis, and they've started to consider as well that it's maybe not just the disease, but it was also the fact that Native Americans were particularly susceptible to disease, which is what made smallpox so very deadly, right? Now, imagine what it was like for Native Americans. They have these aliens, basically. Aliens. They might as well have been from outer space. They arrive. And of course, Columbus, we all know this now, but just to be sure, he behaved very badly, right? He arrived in what is today the Dominican Republic, enslaved Native Americans there, forced them to get gold out of the mountains in the center of the island, and then, took even more back as slaves to Europe when he returned, all right? Of course, there was the endemic warfare between Europeans and Native Americans. There was just the shock of seeing your world just revolutionized, transformed, turned upside down overnight. And not just in one place, but wherever explorers, conquistadors, and settlers arrived, Native Americans saw their world change overnight. All right. So this disease, which was brought from Europe, they were under so much, stress that they were particularly susceptible to these germs that were arriving from Europe. So, the fact that ideas and animals could spread so far and wide across Eurasia did expose them to a disease which they could suffer through, but suffer through over time and eventually become immune to it. It's called herd immunity, right? Where a whole population is no longer susceptible to a disease. But when they brought that disease across the ocean to a place that had never experienced it before, they were immediately susceptible to it because they were all exposed to it at once. So smallpox, thanks to the large landmass and the spreading of animals and people and ideas and exposure over time, protected Europeans and Asians from smallpox, but not Native Americans. And that is the reason why they were so susceptible to these diseases from Europe. But I said I was going to talk about why is it that the worlds were so different. Well, that's technology, right? All of these things which spread across Europe and Asia, because there were so many more people in contact with one another, it put the Native Americans at a material disadvantage. So when Europeans arrived with ships, with metal, with utensils, and indeed with guns, these were things which were tools, which were useful, and Native Americans had never been exposed to before. And they hadn't developed their own sort of homologous advanced technology because there just wasn't the sort of communication that occurred in Eurasia amongst the people living there. It was a much more cosmopolitan place in that sense. The Americas, however, much more isolated, much more provincial, and geography itself is what impeded them from spreading information, ideas, and even animals.